Silence has memory. In the places where there were once voices, now only the echo remains of what no one wanted to hear. There is something unsettling in the stillness of empty places, as if the earth still remembered the footsteps of those who once walked upon it. They say hatred comes suddenly, but that is not true. It arrives slowly, with invisible steps, disguised as discontent, as justice, as love for one's own. No one recognizes it at first. It only seems like another shadow cast by the light of misery. After a war, an entire country looks into the mirror and does not recognize itself. It sees ruins where once there was pride, hunger where there were promises, and enemies even where there are none. Fear begins to speak softly, whispering in taverns, in homes, in newspapers. It speaks with simple words: guilt, betrayal, purity. And people, weary, listen, because it is easier to believe in a cause than to accept loss. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the space where justification takes root, where a joke becomes prejudice, and prejudice becomes habit, where one learns not to look too closely. In the beginning, there were no screams, no fire, only a collective murmur that said, "Something must change." And it did, but not toward hope, toward darkness. Europe, the continent of art, of science, of thought, believed itself immune to fanaticism. It believed its culture was enough to protect it from the abyss. But even reason fades when the soul is hungry, when ideas cease to seek truth and seek only comfort. Hatred was not born overnight. It was born from fear, from frustration, from the need to point a finger when everything was collapsing. That is how compassion faded, first in speeches, then in gazes, and finally in actions. No one noticed the exact moment of change, only the cold was felt. A cold that did not come from winter, but from the heart. How can a cultured modern country, filled with art and thought, fall into the deepest moral darkness of the 20th century? That is the question that still echoes among the ruins. Perhaps the answer lies in this echo, in this silence that still watches us, waiting for someone this time to choose to listen. Germany awoke from the First World War like an exhausted body that no longer knew if it was still alive. The streets were filled with invisible wounds, men returning from the front with empty eyes, women who had learned to survive with almost nothing, children who grew up among ruins and broken promises. The bells rang, but they did not announce victory. They only reminded everyone of what had been lost. The empire had fallen, the Kaiser had fled, and what remained was a country that no longer knew who it was. The defeat was not only military, it was moral, cultural, intimate. The idea of a strong, prosperous, and united Germany had evaporated, leaving behind a fragmented nation sunk in resentment. The Weimar Republic was born from the ruins of that collapse, fragile from the first day, sustained more by the desire to forget than by the conviction to change. The Treaty of Versailles imposed a humiliation that ran deep. Germany had to pay for everything: money, territory, dignity. The economic reparations were impossible to meet. Factories stopped, fields lay empty, and hunger settled in homes like a permanent guest. Banknotes were counted by the millions, but they served for little more than lighting a stove or playing with children. Inflation became absurd, the value of work vanished, savings disintegrated, and hope became an empty word. In cafes, people spoke of the past with painful nostalgia. Retired soldiers remembered the days when the uniform meant honor, and the elderly murmured that at least before there had been order. Wounded pride mixed with fear, and from that mix was born a rage no one knew how to contain. The promises of democracy seemed weak, bureaucratic, incapable of offering anything beyond speeches. Politicians argued, banks collapsed, workers marched for bread, and the bourgeoisie for security. No one trusted anyone. In that void, voices began to appear, voices that said the blame did not belong to everyone, but to some, that the German people had been betrayed from within, that the war had not been lost on the front lines, but in the offices, in the shadows, in the banks. And among all those explanations, an old idea resurfaced, that the Jews were responsible for the nation's misfortune. It was an ancient lie, woven through centuries of prejudice, but in desperate times, lies are easier to believe than truth. The Jews had lived in Germany for generations. They were part of the country's cultural, economic, and scientific fabric. There were doctors, musicians, merchants, professors. But when pain turns into a search for culprits, reason fades. People said they controlled the banks, manipulated the press, profited while others suffered. No one asked if it was true. The truth did not matter. What mattered was having an explanation that eased frustration. Anti-Semitism was nothing new. It was written in sermons and jokes in school books. It was a silent prejudice, sleeping beneath the surface of a society that thought itself modern. But after the war, that prejudice awoke with force. It was no longer just an opinion. It became a narrative, a political tool. The speeches that had once seemed marginal began to fill the squares. Talking about internal enemies gave power, drew applause, offered direction. Meanwhile, daily life became unbearable. Unemployment multiplied, crime increased, the streets filled with veterans wearing worn-out uniforms and invisible wounds. In working-class neighborhoods, despair fed extremism. Some dreamed of a communist revolution like in Russia. Others longed for the return of lost order and glory. Democracy seemed a luxury for better times. What people wanted was stability, a firm voice, someone who promised to rescue the nation. Politics turned into a theater of broken promises. Governments came and went, unable to control the economy or restore trust. In taverns, people argued with restrained fury, pointing at invisible culprits. They stole our country, said some. They sold us for money, said others. The idea of a common enemy began to unite those who had once been divided, and that union, built on anger, became the perfect soil for what was to come. Propaganda began its work before the word propaganda carried shame. Newspapers published caricatures, rumors, headlines repeating the same idea. Germany had been betrayed. Symbols were used to stir emotions, not to convey facts. The press, the speeches, even household conversations began to revolve around the idea of the other who corrupts, who deceives, who weakens. It did not matter whether that other had a real face. It was enough to imagine it. Hatred, once individual, became collective. It stopped being a shameful emotion and turned into a way to belong. It was easier to feel part of something when everyone shared the same anger. In a country where the future seemed impossible, hatred offered direction, purpose, and excuse. Saying they are to blame was, deep down, a way of saying, I am not. Thus, little by little, fear became certainty. Frustration became conviction, pain became ideology, and when that happens, reasoning stops. People no longer seek to understand, only to confirm. Every lie repeated 1,000 times becomes emotional truth, and emotional truth becomes political power. Society began to get used to living among misery and suspicion. The youngest grew up hearing that the future depended on purifying the past, that the nation had to be cleansed of all that had contaminated it. Order, prosperity, pride were promised. No one mentioned the price. In schools, the books began to change. In churches, some sermons adapted to the new language of resentment. In homes, silences became accomplices. Hatred did not yet need uniforms or flags. It only needed time to mature in people's minds, to settle as a daily thought, until one ordinary day, amid hunger and despair, someone said what many were already thinking: Germany needs a savior. And that thought, so simple and so dangerous, was the spark that would soon become a fire. Before hatred, there was fear. Before fear, there was pain. And before pain, there was a society that chose to look away. It was not a secret conspiracy, nor an inevitable fate. It was a chain of small decisions: to stay silent, to accept, to laugh at a joke, to repeat a phrase, to believe a promise. Each gesture, each silence, each excuse added a stone to the path toward darkness. Hatred was not born from pure evil, but from need, from the despair that turns people into believers of any lie that can give them back a little hope. And thus, long before the symbols were painted on flags, long before the speeches filled the squares, Germany had already begun to sink into something deeper than poverty: the loss of its own humanity. Amid confusion, hunger, and wounded pride, a man appeared who knew how to listen to what many wanted to hear. He did not offer real solutions, he offered direction. He did not speak of economics or politics with precision. He spoke of the soul of a people. He promised to restore meaning to a nation that had forgotten who it was. His name was Adolf Hitler, and before becoming the face of absolute evil, he was an ordinary man, lost among the crowd of the defeated. His story did not begin in power, but in frustration. He had known poverty, rejection, and the feeling of not belonging. In Vienna, before the war, he had tried to be an artist. He painted landscapes and facades no one wanted to buy. The academies rejected him. He lived in cheap boarding houses, walked through streets where hunger was so visible it blended with the air. In those years, he found a simple explanation for his failure. It was not he who was broken, it was the world that had betrayed him. That idea stayed in his mind like a bitter seed. The war gave him something he had never had before, a purpose. At the front, he found discipline, belonging, the illusion of being part of something greater. But when the war ended, he lost everything again. Germany surrendered, and with the defeat, his only sense of identity crumbled as well. The feeling of humiliation marked him deeply. For him, the surrender was more than a political event. It was a personal wound. There he began to build the myth of betrayal, the tale of the knife in the back, the idea that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed from within. When he returned from the front, he found a country sunk in chaos. Many complained, but few spoke with the fury he felt, and in that fury, he discovered something. Words could have more power than weapons. He began speaking to small groups, in taverns full of frustrated men, unemployed soldiers, weary citizens. He was not a refined speaker, but he had an intensity that drew people in. He did not speak to the intellect. He spoke to the instinct. His speeches were not meant to convince. They were meant to infect. Hitler quickly learned that crowds do not need arguments. They need emotions, rage, fear, pride, resentment. He mixed them like a chemist who knew his materials well. He did not invent those emotions. They were already there, waiting for someone to give them shape. And he knew how to do it. Every word was a spark on dry ground. His voice trembled, broke, shouted, dropped to a whisper, became almost hypnotic. He did not speak of the present. He spoke of destiny. He did not offer reasons. He offered faith. Hatred in his hands became a political tool. It was not a chaotic impulse. It was a strategy. He transformed collective frustration into a story where Germany was the victim, the enemies were clear, and salvation was embodied in him. He understood that people do not want to think about complex causes. They want to feel that there is meaning behind suffering, and if there is none, someone can invent it. In just a few years, he went from being a nobody to a voice both feared and admired. His oratory did not only seduce, it disciplined. He spoke of sacrifice, of purity, of redemption. He turned hatred into virtue. He said that the suffering of the German people was not useless, but necessary to purify the nation. His words did not just assign blame. They sought to convince every listener that they were part of a mission, and thus politics became an almost religious act. The rallies resembled ceremonies. The flags, the hymns, the symbols, everything was designed to awaken a collective emotion. Hitler understood that power is not imposed only by force, but by belonging. Whoever can turn fear into hope can move crowds, and that is exactly what he did. He was not a genius, as some claim. He was an obsessed man who understood the mechanics of human resentment. His talent did not lie in intelligence, but in his intuition for others' pain. He knew how to interpret the wounds of his time and turn them into a speech. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. Where there was misery, he saw fuel. Every speech was a careful construction. It began with the people's lament, the acknowledgement of shared suffering, and gradually directed it toward a specific enemy. It was a calculated process: empathy, indignation, vengeance. First, he presented himself as one of them, a soldier among soldiers, a German among Germans. Then, when the audience was already caught in his emotion, he rose as the chosen one, the only one capable of leading them out of disaster. People listened to him and felt relief, not because he spoke the truth, but because he offered the illusion of control. Suddenly, defeat had an explanation. Hunger had a face. Confusion had meaning. Everything that hurt could be summed up in a single word: betrayal. And the promise was clear. That betrayal would be avenged. Thus, step by step, the man and the myth became one. Hitler ceased to be a person and became a symbol. He no longer spoke for himself. He spoke for Germany. Every gesture, every word, every silence was loaded with purpose. He did not speak to convince the world. He spoke to conquer the souls of those who listened to him. And he succeeded. Not because of his strength or his intellect, but because millions of people needed to believe in someone. In an era where nothing seemed to make sense, he offered a story where everyone had a role: the good, the bad, the traitors, and the redeemers. It was a dangerous fiction, but a comforting one. He did not create hatred, he simply learned to sell it. He wrapped it in symbols, in promises, in the illusion of national destiny. He turned it into hope. And when hatred disguises itself as hope, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Thus began the fire, not with violence, but with words, not with armies, but with speeches. The crowds that once wandered aimlessly found a new purpose: to believe. And when a people decide to believe blindly in one man, the rest, truth, compassion, doubt, ceases to matter. The man who lit the spark did not invent the fire. He merely directed it toward where everyone wanted to look, away from themselves. Hatred is not imposed by decree. It is cultivated in the desire to believe, in the need to find meaning when everything seems lost. Germany was not dragged into the abyss by force. It walked toward it, convinced it was heading for salvation. After years of despair, the country was exhausted. It had tasted freedom and found it unstable. It had trusted democracy, but democracy had not given it bread or certainty. In the streets, politics was seen as a distant spectacle, a dirty game of elites incapable of understanding the people's suffering. And then came someone who spoke their language, someone who did not promise laws, but destiny. Hitler and his followers did not conquer Germany, they seduced it. They knew how to read the collective fatigue, the nostalgia for the past, and the yearning for order. Instead of speaking of rights, they spoke of identity. Instead of equality, they offered belonging. Freedom, in times of chaos, seemed a dangerous luxury. What people wanted was not to think, but to believe. The National Socialist propaganda machine was the most sophisticated instrument of emotional manipulation Europe had ever seen. It did not merely lie, it transformed the lie into landscape, into habit, into faith. The media, controlled with surgical precision, shaped reality like a sculptor carving a statue. The news, the posters, the films, the parades, everything was part of an immense choreography designed to convince the people that rebirth was happening. On cinema screens, viewers saw a new country: smiling children, strong farmers, disciplined soldiers, women devoted to home and to the nation's future. On the radio, voices carried contagious optimism. The economy improved, unemployment dropped, the trains ran on time. The narrative was perfect. No one spoke of those who were excluded, of those who lost their jobs for having the wrong surname or for thinking differently. The country seemed to bloom, but its roots were already rotten. The masses believed, not because they were ignorant, but because they wanted to believe, because the illusion of order was more comforting than the truth of chaos. Propaganda offered a story in which every citizen had a place. Everyone could feel needed: the worker marching in parades, the child raising his arm in school, the mother teaching her children the new salute. Everyone contributed. Everyone was part of the great national work. Identity became uniform, literally. Uniforms multiplied. Youth leagues, associations, organizations. Each group had its attire, its insignia, its oath. Life itself was organized around the party. Free time ceased to be free. Songs replaced thought. Repetition took the place of reflection. Obedience, once a military virtue, became a civic one. The country that wanted to believe began to speak a new language. Old words changed their meaning. Purity no longer meant cleanliness. It meant exclusion. People no longer meant community. It meant boundary. Homeland no longer evoked love. It evoked surveillance. Everything that sounded noble was used to justify what was vile. Rhetoric became the perfect disguise for the barbarity growing beneath it. The process was so gradual that no one noticed when enthusiasm turned into blind obedience. Celebrations became rituals. Speeches were repeated until they no longer sounded like speeches but like natural truths. Photographs showed millions of faces looking in the same direction, smiling with the same expression. The individual disappeared within the crowd. And when the individual disappears, responsibility disappears as well. The school was one of the places where indoctrination took its deepest roots. Children learned history as if it were myth. They were taught that they belonged to a chosen people, destined to dominate, to purify, to correct the world's mistakes. Books replaced curiosity with obedience. Doubt was punished. Surrender was rewarded. Those young apprentices of faith grew up believing that to serve was to think, and to think was to betray. Families changed too. In the intimacy of their homes, ideology slipped in softly. It crept into games, into songs, into daily habits. Party children denounced parents who spoke ill of the regime. Conversations became cautious. Trust eroded. Neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion. Distrust became part of the social fabric, a form of control more effective than censorship. Meanwhile, the leader became an almost sacred figure. He was not a politician, he was a symbol. His image hung in schools, offices, shops. His face appeared on postcards, portraits, in the dreams of a nation that had decided to surrender to him not only its destiny, but its conscience. The speeches presented him as an infallible guide, a protective father, the voice of the people. No one remembered that a man like that does not listen. He only listens to himself. The cult of personality was the final stage of collective faith. Hymns were sung in his honor. Holidays revolved around his life. Political processions imitated religious ceremonies. The regime understood that emotion was stronger than reason, and Germany, moved by emotion, stopped reasoning. Not everyone participated with enthusiasm. Some doubted, others stayed silent. Some saw the lie and feared it, but even they adapted. In a society where doubt was dangerous, survival required pretending. Silence became a form of defense, and that silence, multiplied by millions, became the sound of consensus. The country that wanted to believe was not a gathering of fanatics, it was a gathering of the weary. Ordinary people who preferred not to see what was happening as long as their lives improved. The price of their well-being was invisible, paid by others, far away, on the margins. But as long as bread returned to the table and work came back, few asked at what cost. Propaganda did not just lie, it taught pride in the lie. It convinced the people that the sacrifice of some was necessary for the rebirth of all. Hatred was sold as medicine. Revenge was called justice. Silence was called duty. And when language is corrupted, conscience follows. Symbols flooded the streets. Flags waved as if the wind itself believed. Stadiums filled. Marches seemed endless. There was music, fire, light. Everything was spectacular. But the spectacle was the disguise of fear. Behind every choreography, behind every speech about greatness, there was an unspoken warning. Those who do not join will disappear. The Germans learned to live with two realities. The visible one, full of splendor and order, and the hidden one, where lists began, where records were kept, where people disappeared. But the second reality was never spoken of. It was more comfortable to believe it did not exist. Denial became a national defense mechanism. People grew used to thinking that evil, if it happened elsewhere, under other circumstances, to other people. Believing became easier than knowing. Propaganda had achieved its final goal, to turn lies into landscape and thought into threat. There was no longer any need to impose obedience. Each citizen carried it within. The system did not need constant surveillance because people watched each other. Truth no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was belonging. That was how Germany, the country of poets, of philosophers, of music and reason, surrendered to an illusion. Not because it was weak, but because it wanted to believe that its pain had meaning. It wanted to believe that order was worth more than freedom, that pride was nobler than doubt, that silence was more patriotic than truth. And when an entire nation confuses obedience with virtue, disaster ceases to be a possibility, and becomes destiny. The danger was not only Hitler, it was the will to believe him, the comfort of closing one's eyes, the hope that someone else would fix the chaos, even if to do so they had to destroy what was human. Germany did not fall by imposition. It fell because it wanted to believe that salvation could be born from hatred. And so, among hymns, flags, and applause, the country that dreamed of redemption walked, smiling, into its own darkness. The moment when hatred ceased to be an idea and became a rule did not happen suddenly. It was a slow, meticulous process, almost imperceptible at first. Every decree, every regulation, every administrative instruction was a brick in the construction of a system that reorganized the entire life of a nation. What had once been whispered, what had existed only in rumor, became written law, sanctioned and backed by the power of the state. The words of speeches turned into official documents. Prejudice became decree. Human differences were transformed into legal categories. The administration, the courts, the civil registry offices, the ministries, all took part in a vast project of systematic exclusion. Every citizen, whether aware or not, was being reprogrammed to accept a moral hierarchy that divided the world between the fit and the unfit. The first stage was administrative: classify, register, control. Ancestry records, family lists, ethnic and religious categories were implemented. The everyday life of millions came to depend on forms and official seals. Each document could determine who was allowed to work, study, marry, or even inhabit certain spaces. Bureaucracy became a silent weapon, more effective than immediate violence, because it taught society to live within the rules of hatred. Fear changed its nature. It was no longer the abstract fear of an external enemy or of economic uncertainty. It became legal fear. Fear of exclusion, of disappearing from the records, of losing fundamental rights without warning. Ordinary citizens quickly learned to measure their words, to control their gestures, to censor their gaze. Distrust was no longer optional. It became a mechanism of survival. Legal discrimination did more than separate. It educated. Public spaces, schools, workplaces, and official institutions began to transform into zones where belonging determined existence itself. Exclusion ceased to be an occasional act. It became routine. Society internalized the idea that some people had no right to participate fully in civil life. Humanity became relative, dependent on a certificate, a stamp, a piece of paper. While bureaucracy operated with precision, society began to assume its role. It was not necessary for every citizen to strike or humiliate. Passive complicity, the daily acceptance of unjust rules, was enough to sustain the system. People were taught to see others not as individuals, but as categories. Obedience ceased to be a civic virtue and became a tool of survival. Every signature, every procedure, every act of compliance reinforced the structure of hatred. Direct violence began to appear gradually, first as harassment, bullying, and discrimination in neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. Certain individuals were denied jobs, expelled from educational institutions, and forbidden access to public services. The law justified these acts, and society normalized them. Each incident taught a lesson. Those who do not belong have a defined place, and that place is exclusion, invisibility, marginalization. Symbols of control multiplied in daily life. Official seals, assigned numbers, required documents, certificates of origin and purity all served as constant reminders of who was inside and who was out. No direct intimidation was needed. The law itself, the administrative structure, functioned as an instrument of fear. Every citizen knew that a mistake, an omission, a gesture of solidarity with the excluded could mean punishment. Discipline became a daily ritual. The system also transformed human relationships. Social surveillance became part of routine. Neighbors, friends, co-workers, even family members learned to watch one another. Trust vanished. Private life, family conversations, children's games, all were conditioned by the fear of being discovered supporting those considered undesirable. Silence became a survival strategy, and society itself became complicit in its own subjugation. Legal violence was complemented by economic exclusion. Boycotts were organized against businesses owned by persecuted groups. Access to services and markets was restricted, and jobs were systematically lost. Hunger, need, and hardship became weapons of submission. People learned to look away or to justify what was happening. It was easier to believe it was justice than to confront the brutality of the system. The first internment camps appeared under the pretext of maintaining order and protecting society. At first, they were administrative control centers, places to concentrate those considered problematic, non-conforming, or dangerous, according to legal criteria. But the message was clear: belonging no longer guaranteed rights. The law decided who fully existed and who did not. Physical violence was not yet massive, but the structure was ready. The first records, the seals, the written names marked the beginning of a system that would turn life into numbers, codes, and procedures. Every public policy, every decree, every administrative order had a silent but profound effect. It taught the population to accept injustice as routine. The extraordinary became normal. Society internalized violence. Every act of compliance, every obedience, every signed document, every silence contributed to strengthening the machinery of oppression. Bureaucracy became the deadliest instrument because it made millions cooperate without raising their voices. Institutionalized hatred became self-sustaining. Citizens learned to participate in the system even without intending to. By following rules, by looking away, by ignoring exclusion, they became part of the machinery. Violence ceased to be visible and became administrative routine. Each updated record, each reviewed document, each stamped seal reaffirmed the hierarchy that classified human life into categories. The psychological effect was devastating. The normalization of discrimination made society lose its capacity for outrage in the face of injustice. People learned to live with constant but domesticated fear, with automatic obedience, with silent complicity. The law not only prohibited, it also taught, molded, indoctrinated. Every citizen became an instrument of a system that operated with relentless precision. Hatred was fully consolidated when it became routine. Bureaucracy, administration, records, lists, decrees, and procedures created a web that trapped millions without the need for immediate physical violence. Society internalized the imposed hierarchy. Rules were obeyed not out of moral conviction, but out of fear and habit. Legality legitimized injustice. Justice disappeared. And thus, Germany crossed an invisible but irreversible threshold. Hatred ceased to be a feeling and became a structure. Legal and administrative discrimination turned citizens into both observers and executors. Violence no longer relied on shouts, blows, or visible threats. The bureaucracy, the law, and daily routine were enough to sustain it. The country was transformed into a system where humanity was measured by documents, seals, and categories. Obedience ceased to be a virtue and became a survival tool. Violence became institutionalized, silent, methodical, legal, and society learned to accept it as normal. Hatred then reached its most dangerous form. It no longer depended on a speech, an emotion, or a charismatic leader. It had become law, routine, structure. Humanity, reduced to paperwork and records, began to disappear from the everyday reality of those who lived it. Germany, the country that once wanted to believe, no longer merely believed. It obeyed. And when obedience is mistaken for virtue, violence ceases to be questioned, and tragedy becomes destiny. The war was over. The weapons fell silent, but the echo of what had happened continued to resonate in every city, every home, every heart. The empty fields, the silent factories, the halted trains, all reminded humanity of how much could be lost when hatred becomes the norm. Germany had survived physically, but its soul was scarred by obedience, indifference, and lies. The landscape changed. Cities began to rebuild, but the memories remained. Monuments, museums, records, and memorial plaques served a purpose beyond teaching history. They were warnings. They reminded people that indifference has consequences, that silence is complicit, and that responsibility cannot be delegated. Every fallen stone, every rebuilt wall, every name written on a list of victims was a reminder of what happens when a society allows dehumanization to take root. Silence, in many cases, had been more powerful than violence. It was not just the absence of words, it was acceptance, the averted gaze, the joke that minimizes, the excuse that justifies. It was in those small, everyday acts that hatred germinated and grew, transforming into policy, into law, into culture. That is why remembering does not mean merely studying dates or names. It means understanding how everyone's gestures, even the smallest ones, shape the moral fabric of a society. Today, as we walk through those places, as we look into the faces of survivors and read their testimonies, it becomes clear that danger does not begin with incendiary speeches or charismatic leaders. It begins with the normalization of indifference, with the refusal to question what happens around us. It begins in everyday conversation, in the joke that ridicules, in the silence that approves. The message is clear. Memory is not just remembrance, but vigilance. It is not nostalgia, but warning. Every generation bears the responsibility to recognize the signs of injustice and to act before it is too late. The history of Germany teaches us that humanity can be lost gradually, not through blows or wars, but through the routine of complicity and the habit of fear. Today's monuments and museums do not only preserve objects, they preserve lessons. Lessons that remind us we must question, act, and educate. That we must understand empathy and action as antidotes to institutionalized hatred. That being part of a society does not mean obeying without thought, but taking responsibility for protecting all its members, even those who are different, even those who are minorities, even those who might be forgotten. And though time passes, the scars of the past speak to us every day. They remind us that history is not merely a story of what was, but a guide to what could be if we fail to watch our own behavior. That silence, indifference, and excuses are seeds that can grow and destroy everything we call humanity. Because in the end, hatred does not begin in speeches or laws. It begins within us, in our words, in our choices, in our gaze. And if we do not learn to question, to listen, and to act, history can repeat itself, with different faces, in different places, in ways we once thought impossible. If this video made you reflect on how history and silence shape our society, leave your comment below. What do you think we can do today to ensure the lessons of the past are not forgotten? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next content. Sharing this video also helps more people learn about these stories and understand the importance of memory and responsibility. Thank you very much, and see you next time.